Hello and welcome back to European philosophy. So in this part of the lecture, we're going to introduce the figure of Martin Heidegger and his great work, Being and Time. So I want to start with this important quote from the beginning of his great work, Being and Time, which is 1927. And it's a quote from one of Plato's dialogues. It goes like this: "For manifestly you have long been aware of what you mean when you use the expression being. We, however, who used to think we understood it, have now become perplexed." End quote. Now, there's a lot in this quote, but I feel like it expresses something really important in terms of the project Heidegger was trying to do. That when we reflect upon our being, our existence in the world, although we sort of take for granted our existence a lot of the time, when we actually start to think about it, we realize perhaps that we don't understand what it is. We're not quite sure what the word being refers to. And now we're all perplexed. Now, this is a common theme in philosophy, that when we really start thinking about average everyday things in our life, they actually start to become kind of weird or hard to understand. And that means we're really digging down and trying to get to a better level of understanding of them. But they're not as straightforward as perhaps they appear to be in everyday life. So a bit of background about Heidegger. These are his dates. In the periods of 1916 to 1923, he was with Edmund Husserl in Freiburg, was assisting him. He has his famous Black Forest years, 1922 onwards. He spends time in his hut in the Black Forest. Spends a lot of time, in nature, sort of away from others, while writing some of his big works. The later years were known as the Marburg years, where he spent a lot of time thinking about Aristotle, interpreting Aristotle, and we see Being and Time, written and published in 1927. And he also teaches Hannah Arendt, I'll talk about a bit later. He returns to Freiburg later, and he has a bit of a change of direction in terms of what he likes to reflect upon in terms of philosophy, towards themes of art and technology, and so this is sometimes referred to as the turning. 1933 to 45 encompassed the years of World War II. These are his kind of political years where he becomes rector of Freiburg University. And later we see more of an emphasis on art in his post-war work, as revealing truth. So art revealing truth perhaps more than standard philosophical treatises. Now, he's a controversial figure because some of you already know that he has a kind of connection or association with Nazism, and so he was banned from teaching by the Denazification Committee after the war, whose project was to kind of sniff out anyone who had been a Nazi or associated with Nazism, and kind of make sure that they weren't continuing to have any sort of power in the post-war society. In 1950, he was allowed to teach at Freiburg again. In 1966, he gives a famous interview in Der Spiegel, which only gets published in 1976 after his death. And it's believed that he's sort of trying to defend himself a bit, defend his record. It's very controversial. So I'll talk a bit more about the controversy in a moment, but these are his main works. Being and Time is that which is extracted in your reader, so you'll be reading a little bit from that particular work. But he starts, like a lot of phenomenologists, starts with thinking about time, published some lectures on the history of the concept of time. Later, what is metaphysics? He writes a letter on humanism, which is actually a reply to Jean-Paul Sartre. And later, that theme of art, the origin of the work of art, the question concerning technology, particularly in his post-war years. So I want to mention Hannah Arendt because she's one of these women philosophers who's sort of coming up through the ranks in the mid-century onwards. So now she's known as a political philosopher and author. So her background was that she studied philosophy with Heidegger at Marburg. She actually ends up having a secret affair with him. She also studies with Karl Jaspers. Later she flees to Paris and meets Walter Benjamin. And then she escapes to the USA during the war years, works as an editor and then an academic. That's when she begins writing The Origins of Totalitarianism, which gets published in 1951. And that's when she starts to talk about this, or use this phrase, which you may have heard before, the banality of evil. So in 1963, she publishes Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Eichmann was an SS officer who was on trial in the trials after the war crimes trials after the war. And what came out, because she went there to report on it, what came out was that she thought, and at least in her perception, that these people who'd done such evil things were actually kind of banal, that they weren't, monsters with horns coming out of their heads. They were kind of very simple and sort of pathetic, and just kind of this claim about just following orders is like they had no imagination. So that was and remains to this day, a quite controversial thesis about the nature of evil. She writes a controversial essay called Martin Heidegger at 80 in the 70s, where she's seen as defending him. And she died quite young at 69 from a heart attack. All right, so the Heidegger controversies, it's very important to confront this. We never want to, canonize a philosopher, put them on a pedestal and claim that they're perfect. You kind of need to face up to the fact that philosophers aren't perfect and they can do some terrible things. So if we look at his political positions before and during World War II, there's a certain ambiguity of his position. He wasn't exactly that outspoken. So on the one hand, in 1933, he joins the Nazi or NSDAP party, and he gives this 1933 address, the self-affirmation of the German university, which is often interpreted as being supportive of Hitler's rule. On the other, in the 1930s and 30s and 40s, he does give some lectures which appear to give covert criticism of the Nazis. The Nazis, he and other academics were under surveillance by the Gestapo for a period. What was particularly controversial is that Heidegger sort of dobs in Husserl, as which, because of Husserl's Jewish identity, where he's no longer allowed to kind of hold a position in the university. And so this is, considered particularly egregious. So there's a paper by Matthew Sharp, who's another continental philosophy academic in Australia. He published in 2015 called Horrified, No Longer Shocked. That's on reading list. I encourage you to read it. It sort of talks about the challenges of being an academic teaching Heidegger, knowing that he had this problematic association with Nazism and didn't sort of give a full-blown kind of condemnation of it as we would perhaps want him to do. And so, trying to face up to that and understand, can we still teach Heidegger, and how do we teach Heidegger under those conditions? More or less the consensus is, look, there's important ideas in Heidegger, particularly in his early work, that are worth understanding and engaging with, and we can take good things from, but this does not excuse his deficiencies in standing up to Nazism. So in terms of reading Heidegger, Heidegger claimed his writings were not works but paths. That is, they're not meant to be a world view, this sort of settled world view that you kind of enter into and then completely understand and once and for all. Rather, he uses this metaphor of forest paths, right? So you can think of paths as sort of open-ending. You're wandering along a path and you don't quite know what you're going to come across. So Heidegger's point is that paths of thinking and questioning are open-ended, and ideally they should be free of epistemological and cultural baggage. Okay, so we're not already making claims about how we know things or how much we know or any other kind of cultural assumptions. We're just kind of open-minded and looking to understand being. So in that regard, he talks about the lighting or the clearing of being. So you're walking along through a forest, say, and suddenly you come upon a clearing where the trees sort of thin out a bit and the light comes in and you can see things more clearly. So Heidegger thinks reading philosophy and doing philosophy is a bit like that. You're kind of wandering through a forest of possibilities, and then you kind of every now and then see things more clearly. So a little bit more about this metaphor of a clearing in a forest. So he uses this term, the clearing. So it's a space or opening, and it's an opening through which entities other than ourselves can emerge out of what Heidegger calls hiddenness. Okay, so there's a lot of things we don't see or don't understand. In one sense, the clearing is a place where such unconcealment occurs, where things that are hidden become unhidden. But in another, Dasein, or being there, our existence itself, is the clearing. So when we come to the clearing, Heidegger thinks our horizons shift. Some entities go back into the dark and others emerge. Now, maybe there's limits to this metaphor because experience can be more dynamic than that. Maybe we're more active than passive in terms of trying to uncover the truth. So maybe it's like we're going into the forest and we're actually clearing the forest ourselves. We're chopping down a few trees or moving things out of the way so we can see. So you might want to think and reflect upon the ultimate meaning of this term, the clearing. So some key themes in Heidegger we're going to be investigating. The biggest one, most important for him, is the question of the meaning of being, or the meaning of our existence, right? But also, he's got this theme that this question has been forgotten since the ancient Greeks. So he particularly thinks since before Socrates, the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers had some sense of being or were questioning the nature of being. And then he thinks this sort of gets forgotten a bit with the later ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato. He thinks language reveals something about being, especially through the origins of our modern philosophy words. So a lot of our philosophy words, including the word philosophy itself, will come from an ancient language. So philosophy comes from Greek and means love of wisdom, or Latin. So looking at the origins of our words can sometimes help us, Heidegger thinks, to understand our being, because our being sort of developed through language. Also, he focuses on the need for dismantling, or in a modern, using a modern word, deconstructing modern philosophy. So, for example, Kant's and Descartes' philosophies, some of these philosophies you might have studied in first year philosophy, not exactly rejecting them, but kind of deconstructing them, taking them apart critically. Then there's the idea of the relationship to the world. So we're not just beings, but we're beings in the world, and we're in the world, not just like in a container, but we sort of care about what's going on. We worry about what's going on and what's around us. So there's this term care, among other terms that Heidegger uses to express the nature of the lived relationship to the world. Then there's different modes of being we can be in, for example, anxiety and concern, which have particular meanings for Heidegger, and we'll talk about that. And later questions of art and technology and the meaning of those things in human lives. So often Heidegger's work is divided into three periods. We're particularly focusing on the phenomenological decade, this 10 years, 1917 to 1927, out of which emerges Being and Time. But then there's the turning, a bit of a change in direction for his work, away from the principal focus on Dasein, existence, and later more concerned with some broad issues of the nature of truth, and as I've mentioned, art and technology, rather than the language of metaphysics. So in the earlier decades, Husserl particularly focuses on language and the origins of key philosophical words. Some influences include Aristotle, I've already mentioned, and Heidegger thinks it's very important to have an historical perspective when it comes to examining so-called philosophical problems, trying to understand how and when they emerge and what other philosophers have said about them and how that affects us today in the kind of language that we use. Franz Brentano again on intentionality, which is an influence on Husserl too. Husserl himself, who teaches Heidegger, especially Husserl in his later period, the fifth and sixth logical investigations and phenomenology. This is all feeding into Heidegger's work, the focus on experience, particularly on what it's like to be in the world. Dilthey, a philosopher who's associated with hermeneutics or interpretation. Heidegger is very interested in the way we interpret our lives. And Heidegger was actually did some studies in a Catholic seminary for a while, and that also influences the use of hermeneutics in his work. That is, this focus on interpreting text, because in any kind of religious institution you will spend a lot of time studying texts, analysing texts, trying to draw the meaning out of them. And so that's what Heidegger does a lot too. And he's interested in that process. By what means do we understand texts or draw meaning from texts? So this is what Heidegger says in his essay My Way to Phenomenology about some of his influences. He says Husserl's teaching took place in the form of a step-by-step training in phenomenological seeing, which at the same time demanded that one relinquish the untested use of philosophical knowledge. But it also demanded that one give up introducing the authority of the great thinkers into the conversation. However, the clearer it became to me that the increasing familiarity with phenomenological seeing was fruitful for the interpretation of Aristotle's writings, the less I could separate myself from Aristotle and the other Greek thinkers. This is quite interesting. So he's taking up Husserl's themes of coming to experience fresh without already having all this so-called philosophical knowledge, like, for instance, thinking that I am a thinking thing, without actually testing that, like everything has to be tested. And also not just saying, oh, well, Kant said this, so we all have to accept what Kant said. No appeal to the authority of previous great thinkers. We just have to do the phenomenological seeing and describing ourselves and draw what we can from that. So on the one hand, Heidegger is taking that from Husserl, but on the other hand, he's kind of moving beyond it, because as he said, he starts to apply this to someone like Aristotle's work, and then he starts to go back and go deeper into the original Greek thinkers and starts to see something important happening in those earlier times that's relevant to how we do philosophy today, but not in terms of subjecting yourself to a flat authority, but more because when you look at their texts, they give you suggestions about how to approach thinking about being, which is Heidegger's topic or object of study. So there's a later move from more transcendental phenomenology that is based on this notion of the transcendental ego, the ultimate ego that is directed towards all things, which Husserl talks about, to what is called more hermeneutical phenomenology. So you might recall Husserl talks of the transcendental or pure ego, which cannot itself be doubted. For Heidegger, there's a new starting point, and it's not this pure ego or pure consciousness, but it's actually embodied human being, or Dasein, which means being there. Right? So it's a rejection of Husserl's idea of this transcendental ego that you sort of can't doubt. It's an emphasis on phenomenology as interpretative. Okay, so it's ongoing. And everything, including our ego, we can constantly interpret and think about it in new ways. We're essentially interpretative beings, which basically means we're quite open-ended. So he rejects specifically the Cartesian or from Descartes element in Husserl's thought. He thinks the cogito, the I think, the famous I think, therefore I am, from Descartes, should be turned around. So in other words, it's I am, therefore I think. That's interesting, isn't it? So what does this hermeneutical method employ? Heidegger wants to give what he says is an existential analytic of Dasein, that is analysing the nature of our being or existence in the world. And he describes this method as existential hermeneutical. It's about the practical way we relate to things in the world, whereby we're constantly interpreting everything in the world. And he also focuses on interpreting important words in metaphysics that have sort of been handed down to us in philosophy, but we're never quite sure what they mean. So, for example, being, truth, phenomenon, logos, and so on. Right? So these words that turn up in philosophy, he wants to kind of go back to and interpret and reinterpret and think about the ways we understand these terms. So essentially what Heidegger does is take Husserl's initial notion of intentionality and transform it so that he moves beyond that original picture of the intentional structure of consciousness where you've got ego on the one hand and everything else about the world on the other. The ego is constantly directing itself towards this world. He's interested in the relationship between Dasein, being there or existence, and being more generally, the broader being of the whole world, right? And he's interested particularly in our practical comportments in the world, that is how we manage the world, how we hold ourselves and with regard to the world in our everyday life. So for that reason, he thinks Dasein's basic structure is being in the world. The hyphenation is important because for Heidegger, we're never just being or ego, we're always being in the world. That's why he doesn't like Husserl's starting point of the transcendental ego, that's always directing itself towards everything else in the world. On the contrary, Heidegger thinks we're always already in the world. Right? So there's no such thing as being not in the world or being separated out from the world. So Heidegger says, whence and how is it determined what must be experienced as the things themselves in accordance with the principles of phenomenology? Is it consciousness and its objectivity, or is it its unconcealedness and concealment? This is a provocative question. You might recognise that phrase, the things themselves, from last week's lecture on Husserl. This was a motto of Husserl, back to the things themselves. And he's asking a question about, well, what exactly is it that we experience as the things themselves? Because Heidegger says, well, it's consciousness and its objectivity. We've got this transcendental ego that's also got a psychological presence and an embodied presence in the world. And it kind of shores up the objectivity of the existence of ourselves. But Heidegger offers something a bit more ambiguous. The notion of beings or experiences unconcealedness, that is being open to view, and concealment. Okay, and so this theme of concealment and unconcealment is very common in Heidegger, because Heidegger thinks, like through that metaphor of the clearing, that sometimes being is rather opaque to us, and we can't really see what exactly it is we're meant to be experiencing, or we don't totally understand our experience. And sometimes we have these moments of insight, right? So on the one hand, Heidegger still identifies with the slogan, back to the things themselves. He thinks experience is really, really important, and particularly the things we experience, other subjects and animals and trees and everything else that's in the world, all of this is important for our experience. But he rejects the idea of phenomenology as a rational system. Okay, he's not as so fixated on the idea of being able to understand and expose the nature of our experience as a rational system in the way that Husserl does. So he actually interprets this slogan as reject all philosophical systems, okay, which is contra Husserl. Okay, he's kind of against that sort of systematization. So flowing on from this notion of concealment and unconcealment is this term aletheia, from the Greek revelation of truth. Okay. So he says the unconcealedness of what is present, it's being revealed and showing itself. Okay. That which phenomenological investigations rediscovered as a supporting attitude of thought proves to be the fundamental trait of Greek thinking, if not indeed of philosophy as such. Okay. So what he's saying is that in the Greek term for truth, which gets translated as truth, it's really kind of unconcealment or revelation of truth. So truth is unconcealing that which was concealed before. And in this sense, if we relate this to the notion of appearances, that things appear to us and sometimes disappear, but then appear again, you know, the phenomenon that we encounter in the world, Heidegger thinks the Greeks already had a kind of phenomenology, and it was basically forgotten, right? So for Heidegger, Western philosophy has forgotten about being, and he calls this forgetting metaphysics. So when he's critiquing what he calls metaphysics, what he means is that it's a kind of philosophy that inquires about small b beings, different kinds of objects and subjects in the world, but not capital B being itself. So he says being gets obliterated. He says we need to overcome metaphysics of this sort, but first we need to understand it. So on the one hand, he's really immersing himself in the history of philosophy and going back to the ancient Greeks, but also he's trying to understand how there was sort of this path that led us away from phenomenology and away from studying being itself. So he gives what he calls a history of capital B being, the history of how we studied everything except being, and then forgot about real being, he thinks. So he wants to ask basically big questions about human existence itself, not just about this particular existence and that particular existence. So let's think about this notion of being in the world. Heidegger gives an etymological account of the phenomenological method. he's concerned with the roots of words, that is, the science of studying the roots of words. And so he'll take some keywords and trace them back to some ancient Greek words that were used and show, thereby reveal what he thinks are their original and important meaning. So phenomenology, as Heidegger understands it, was understood and practiced by the ancient Greek philosophers. So this is his analysis of the term phenomenology. He says phenomenon means to show oneself, and logos is a discourse or a science to bind together. It's related to our term ligament, binding together. Phenomenon and logos, letting what is to be seen show itself. Right. So when you put these terms together, you have this idea of something that is already structured in such a way that it will be seen, and finally it really does show itself. Heidegger says the expression phenomenology signifies primarily a methodological conception. This expression does not characterize the what of the objects of philosophical research as subject matter, but rather the how of that research, end quote. So I did reference that quote in the earlier lectures. Heidegger wants to make the point that this phenomenology represents an approach to studying the world, but doesn't pick out any particular thing to study. So it's an approach you can take to anything we experience or encounter in the world. So let's look at this particular project, Being and Time, from 1927. So he's wanting to describe this obscuring of the notion of being over time. And he talks about a gigantomachia, that is a battle of the giants over being, which is a picture that's taken from Plato's dialogue, The Sophist. So the idea that these big giants of philosophy are tackling each other over the nature of being, and that this battle is still going. Right? So Heidegger sees himself as taking on this big question concerning the meaning of being or the truth of being and so on, via an analysis of what it is to be human, what it's like to be a human in the world. This is the overall structure of Being and Time. So what's extracted in your continental philosophy reader is from the introduction to it, the exposition of the question of the meaning of being. So the introductory part. There's part one, which focuses on temporality, explication of time, the importance of time for our being, hence the title Being and Time. It's divided into 3 divisions. So division 3 never gets completed, part 2 never gets completed. So it's fundamentally an uncompleted work. However, what's there is enough fodder for philosophers for many years to come. So division 1 is an analysis of Dasein, or being there, our being, in its spatiality and relation to the world. This includes terms like being in the world and care, and it's part of what he calls an existential analytic, and we'll talk about all of that when we go into a bit more detail. And division 2 was meant to be about the temporality of Dasein, for example, being towards death, and notions of authenticity, which is a term that becomes very much associated with existentialism later. So just a reference note, Being and Time has numbered sections, paragraphs, and there's original pagination that was used. And so you can pretty much cross-reference via these numbered sections, different editions. So let's look at that term Dasein. It literally means being there. Okay, so it's someone's particular being, not just being anywhere, being there. So my particular being, your particular being. And what's important for Heidegger about human being is that its being can be a question for it, unlike the being of objects. Right? So an object doesn't sit there, your desk or your computer doesn't sit there saying, what kind of being am I? But humans ask questions like, what kind of being am I? Even forgetting about being, as philosophers have done, Heidegger argues it's still a mode of Dasein. That is, it's still a way of existing in the world. So forgetting about my existence and just sort of taking it for granted, that's also a mode of being there. So Heidegger says, thus to work out the question of being adequately, we must make an entity, the inquirer, transparent in its own being. This entity which each of us is himself and which includes inquiring as one of the possibilities of its being, we shall denote by the term Dasein. So this is a very famous passage from the beginning of Being and Time. This is in your reader, page 28. So what's important there is he's saying is that Dasein is about inquiry or questioning. To be a human existence is to be an existence that asks questions, that inquires about its own being. He goes on to say Dasein is an entity which does not just occur among other entities, rather it is ontically distinguished by the fact that in its very being, that being is an issue for it. Okay, so Heidegger is making it very clear that what makes us stand out from the rest of the world is the fact that our own being is an issue for us. We're like, well, what kind of being am I? Is that good or is that bad? What should I do? What's the purpose of my existence? These kinds of questions are only questions that humans ask, according to Heidegger. He says, Dasein always understands itself in terms of existence, in terms of possibility of itself, to be itself or not itself. Dasein has either chosen these possibilities itself, or got itself into them, or grown up in them already. So here he's trying to unpack our existence a bit more, and knowing that there's always this possibility of things happening to me that I've chosen myself, or I haven't chosen myself, or I've somehow found myself within them or grown up in them. Okay, and so there's always these kind of questions around what surrounds us. Heidegger makes the point that Dasein decides its existence, firstly actively by taking hold, but also passively by neglecting. So he thinks like even if you decide to kind of be really passive and you kind of just let life happen to you, he thinks that's in itself is a kind of choice, right? It's a kind of decision. It's just a passive decision, but it's a decision. So just to clarify that distinction between capital B being versus individual beings. Okay, so there's Sein and Seinendes, to be, and then beings and entities is what's getting translated from the original language. So capital B being stands for existence in the sense of your and my being there, and then small b being is a thing which exists. And Heidegger uses this term, the ontological difference, to reference the difference between just being another thing in the world and actually being a Dasein, some being that participates in this capital B being, this true existence. So he uses a couple of adjectives, ontic, to do with particular beings, and then ontological, to do with being, or capital B being in general. Okay. So Heidegger thinks modern philosophy has forgotten about this capital B being and has reduced it to a study of beings as objects. So that's probably in a nutshell Heidegger's big critique of the nature of modern philosophy, is that it makes the mistake of thinking that everything, including humans, is on the model of particular beings and not existence itself. So that's why he wants to focus on what he calls a fundamental ontology, by giving an existential analytic of Dasein. So he thinks if we analyse the existential nature of our being in the world, what it's like to be in the world, we will get an ontology of being in general, a fundamental ontology of what it's like to be, to truly exist in the world. So the term ontology means science of being, and for Heidegger, all ontology is founded in Dasein. Okay, so he thinks if there's a science of being, you start with what it's like to be a human being in the world. You don't start with stones or planets or anything like that. You start with humans. He has some interesting things to say about existence and possibility. Firstly, only Dasein exists. He thinks existence is not an essence. It's not a what, but a how. So it can't be understood analogous to an object. He thinks only human beings are open to the being present of things in the world. Okay, so it's a way of existing in the world. So for him, such things as stones are what he calls merely real. Plants and animals are real, but more than real, they're living. But he thinks human beings go beyond living. He thinks they're actually existing. in this deeper sense, beyond any particular essence. So they have this essentially open-ended way of being in the world. So this term existence comes from a term meaning to stand out. We stand outside ourselves, Heidegger thinks, and we question ourselves in the world. So he uses this technical language, which is not so used these days, but it's useful to know it. So we have the existential, which is activities we engage in, and then the existential or existentialia, plural, the conditions of possibility for the activities we engage in. So how can I engage in this activity? Well, because there are conditions that allow me to engage in this activity. So Heidegger thinks in terms of the method he uses in Being and Time, we can interpret the existential, the activities we engage in, to find the existentialia, the conditions for the kinds of activities we engage in, the kind of existence we have in the world. So in Being and Time, there's two levels of analysis: the existential level, that is looking at ourselves, our essence as finitude, but then the existential level, which is how we live our essence, choosing our finitude. So you can sort of look at the finite, very practical ways of engaging with the world, practical everyday existence. But then we can take another perspective where we look at how we actually choose every day the type of existence we have in the world. So Heidegger uses this term average everydayness, which is a great term, for the way we exist in the world most of the time, and he wants to analyse that and describe it. And by doing that, he wants to move from an implicit to a more explicit understanding of our being. He thinks we implicitly, on an everyday level, kind of understand our existence, but we need to make it explicit, or at least the point of philosophy is to be more explicit about it. Okay, I'll take a break there, and in the next part we'll dig more deeply into these themes.